I'll continue to remember one of my best friends at Oxford, who was a fellow West Pointer. We'd stayed up late one night in December of 1967 discussing life and death in Vietnam. And we finally came down to the old adage: if there's nothing worth fighting and dying for, then maybe there's nothing worth living for. 33 years later, I think there's still a lot of truth in it. I happen to believe there is a lot worth living for, and therefore, there's a lot worth fighting for, and we're going to continue to do just that.
When I think of everything he's done in his life, the thing that always strikes me is he's a true believer in this country in a way that's almost like a Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of aw shucks gee whiz way, but that's really who he is, and it's really how he thinks. And so he runs understanding the value of every individual person. He's an optimist. He believes people are ultimately good and that they want to do the right thing. He leads by example. My father was born in 1944 to what at that time was considered a mixed marriage. My grandfather was a second-generation American, Russian Jew, and my grandmother was from Arkansas and born and bred in this country. So it's about as multicultural as you could have gotten, you know, in 1944.
My father was a tremendous influence in my life. He had a huge, warm personality. And he read to me every night. He bought me present every Saturday. And then one night he read to me, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and there were a lot of adults in the apartment. They kept me from going to the bedroom. That was the night he died. Then we moved to Little Rock, and my mother had to go back to work. And my grandmother and Granddad took care of me.
Wesley had great big dark eyes. He had a sweet smile. And I think the people, especially the adults, they just melted when they saw him because he had a darling personality.
Wesley was 4 years older when we lived in the same neighborhood. He included me when others didn't, and that was always, I loved him for that. There was a kindness that he had that wasn't evident in a lot of the kids in the neighborhood.
My mother remarried when I was in the 5th grade. So at that point I had a father again. We went fishing, we went shooting every single weekend. Go up to the top of the lake, fish for crappie, find the brim beds in the springtime. It was great life.
When he was a child, he did not have much. None of us did. By today's standards, I think some people would say we were probably poor.
My mother was a secretary in a bank, and she would take me upstairs and she'd take me and say, "This is my son." And she was very proud of me. She introduced me. She taught me how to meet people, and she set high standards.
The students respected him, and the teachers admired him. He was sensitive to other people's feelings, and he led his class in most everything.
Wesley was probably the best swimmer I ever saw. If he'd really devoted his life to it, he could have been at the Olympic level. We had a statewide meet in which we had to swim an individual medley relay. We were a man short, and the officials assumed that we would forfeit. And Wesley Clark said, "We're not forfeiting." And they said, "Why not?" He said, "I'll swim 2 events." We wound up, to the surprise of everyone, winning the state championship. But what people didn't understand is we had the best swimmer in the state in Wesley Clark.
I sort of had in mind to be an astronaut, but then my eyes went bad on me in the junior year in high school, and I went to American Legion Boys State, and there was a West Point cadet there, and he was wearing glasses. And somebody had asked him, "Can you wear glasses at West Point?" And he said, "Yes." And I remember walking outside and telling one of my friends, I said, "That's it. I'm going to West Point." What I remember is being out at Trophy Point, looking up the Hudson River, and people raised their right hands and they took their oath. It wasn't college. We were in the United States Armed Forces. My high school friends were still having a great summer, and I had had my head shaved. I was being yelled at, and it was new cadet barracks.
Wes was very much respected intellectually at West Point. You knew something special was happening when you walked into you were in the #1 mathematics class out of 800 people, and you saw this guy sitting in the #1 seat. This same guy was the #1 in advanced physics class, and you saw that guy sitting in the same seat in the English class, you knew there was some special person there.
Wes and I met at a dance in New York. My father's secretary was a volunteer for the USO. It was a USO dance for midshipmen and West Point cadets.
I looked over at the door, and in came a couple of young ladies, and one of them was very pretty.
Everybody loved Gert. She had a wonderful figure. She had a just very outgoing personality, very smart, and there was a lot of competition for Gert.
I figured, well, I better get there first.
I liked him right away. He was very different than the young men I was used to dating. He was far more intellectual, and in many ways far more innocent.
We were taught as cadets that it was one of the greatest things you could ever offer a girl was a chance to come to West Point for a weekend date. And I said, well, we're going to have a swimming team picnic next week up at West Point. Would you like to come? And she looked at me and she said, maybe. She said I could call her. And I was a little bit crushed by this, but intrigued.
We were married in Brooklyn, New York on June 24th, 1967. We had our reception at a naval base out by the water out in Queens, and it was quite lovely.
Right after Wes and Gert got married, they went to England, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Oxford was probably the most anti-war, anti-military place in the English-speaking world. That's how they started their married life together.
During the time I was at Oxford, almost everybody in my class had gone to Vietnam. We'd already had more than a dozen classmates killed, including my roommate. My wife was 3 months pregnant when I left, and I kissed her goodbye and walked off.
I remember driving home, and I almost had an accident because all I can think about was, what would I ever do without him?
It was the age of Aquarius, and there was rebellion in the sounds, but I think in the minds of at least those of us in the officer corps, there was only duty, honor, country.
Wesley Clark was my A Company commander. I was his immediate boss. The day that Wes was wounded, they had walked out into heavier jungle.
And all of a sudden, I heard a buzzing sound of hornets, and I realized that I'd been shot.
When I got above Wes with my helicopter, which again was like 2 minutes later, I'm looking down. I could see West. I could see all the stuff. He wasn't lying down. He was standing up, and I'm having this conversation with him, and I'm looking at him. He's looking up at me. And
I was hollering to get the machine gun up and the rest of the platoon up.
And the last thing he was concerned with was himself.
The doorbell rang, and it was the Western Union. And I opened it up, and I had my son in my arms, and it said, "We're sorry to inform you that your husband's been seriously wounded." It was the longest day and the longest night of my life.
I didn't recognize him. He was in stitches and bandages and casts. His arm, he got shot by 4 rounds of an AK-47.
It was that coolness under fire, his selfless courage to go to the rescue of others in his convoy, in the face of serious, really painful wounds that I think mark an awful lot of Wes's courage and character.
And there was this 10% slice of my mind that said, you're going to get out of here, and you're going to go home, and you're going to see that baby. And he was